Every traitor Primarch is still in the books. Horus, who killed his father, named, illustrated, sold to you on a model box. Angron, Fulgrim, Mortarion, Magnus, Lorgar, Perturabo, Alpharius. 9 sons betrayed the Emperor, and the Imperium kept every single one of their names. It kept the names of the men who burned Terra. But 2 sons, the 2nd and the 11th, were erased so completely that 10,000 years later their own brothers will not say their names out loud. Stop and look at that. The Imperium remembers its traitors and forgets its loyal sons. That is not how shame works. You do not carefully preserve the record of the man who tried to murder your God, and then delete the record of the men who served him faithfully. Unless the loyalty itself was the problem.
Unless what the 2nd and the 11th did in the Emperor's name was so effective and so dangerous that the Imperium decided it was safer to erase 2 heroes than to let the galaxy know what they had been used for. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming, because this is the part most channels get wrong. I am not going to tell you the names of these 2. I am not going to tell you whether they are alive, dead, hidden, or distributed across a dozen chapters. The lore does not say, and anyone who tells you it does is selling you a guess wearing a costume. What I am going to do is something narrower and, I think, far more damning. I am going to take the one thing the Imperium could not hide, the shape of the hole it left, and show you that the shape itself is a confession. The thesis is this: the 2nd and the 11th were not expunged for treachery, and they were not expunged for failure. They were expunged because their loyal service exposed something the Imperium could not allow on the record. And the proof is structural. The Imperium preserved the names of 9 traitors while erasing 2 loyalists. That only makes sense if the danger was never disloyalty at all. The danger was what their loyalty accomplished. So start with the asymmetry, clean, before we touch a single theory. There were 20 legions raised at the first founding, 20 Primarchs to lead them. The official record, the one the Imperium itself maintains across 10,000 years of obsessive bureaucracy, gives you 18 with names and 2 with nothing. A Roman numeral and an absence behind it, at the 2nd and at the 11th. According to the Lexicanum and the Unified Canon, those 2 Primarchs and the entire Astartes of their legions were deliberately struck from all known imperial records before the Horus heresy even began. Not lost. Struck. There is a word for this in High Gothic, and the Imperium uses it without flinching. Damnatio memoriae. Condemnation of memory. The mechanism is called an edict of obliteration, and imperial historians have a grim little league table of every time it has been used, and they agree, on the record, that the erasure of the 2nd and the 11th is the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in the history of mankind. Sit with that ranking for a moment. The most successful, not the most justified, not the most tragic, the most successful, as in the one the censors are proudest of. Now hold that against the other half of the ledger. 9 Primarchs turned traitor in the heresy. Every one of them kept his name. You can buy their statues. You can read 400 pages of interior monologue from the one who put a blade through the Emperor on his own command deck. The Imperium that struck 2 of its loyal sons from existence so thoroughly that the most powerful intelligences in the galaxy cannot agree they ever drew breath. That same Imperium will happily sell you a boxed model of the son who tried to depose its god. 18 names survive. 2 do not. And the 2 that do not are the 2 that, as far as anyone can establish, never raised a hand against their father. That is the entire case, in miniature, and everything that follows is just me refusing to let you look away from it. Here is what the canon refuses to print, and what it accidentally let slip anyway. Because the erasure was not total. It could not be, not across 10,000 years. There is a record, placed by accident into copies of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer in the 41st millennium, that names the 2nd and the 11th exactly once, and it names them in the worst possible context for the Imperium's cover story.
It places both legions at the Rangdan Xenocides. If you do not know that war, understand that it was the most terrible thing the early Imperium ever survived before the heresy. 3 campaigns against the Rangda across the 860s of M30. Over 80,000 Astartes lost across the whole of it. The First Legion alone, the Dark Angels, the largest and most powerful legion of the age, lost 50,000 of their own in the final Xenocide and never truly recovered. It took the Emperor himself and at least 9 legions to stymie the threat. And there, fighting in the worst war the species had yet faced, alongside the Solar Auxilia, holding the Northern Imperium together while better-remembered legions bled white, were the 2nd and the 11th. Notice what that means. The last documented act of the 2 erased legions was not betrayal, it was the opposite.
Their final appearance in the historical record is them doing the hardest, most necessary, most thankless work the Imperium had to offer, and doing it well enough to be worth recording, before someone decided that record had to disappear. And the document itself, a field guide to the Rangdan Xenocides, may, the wiki notes dryly, be the very reason they were wiped. As if the connection between what they did in that war and what was done to them afterward was so direct that the safest thing was to delete the war record along with the men. That is the first thread. The men erased hardest were last seen serving hardest, and the erasure of those 2 legions was not a thing the Imperium did quietly to itself and then forgot. There is a witness to it, inside the canon, in the worst possible place.
In the novel that follows Angron, a dreadnought of the World Eaters, a war machine old enough to remember the founding years, with a living mind sealed inside it, says it flatly to a mortal officer. Twice before, he says, the Emperor has purged his own progeny and every living soul within the legions that followed them. Read that sentence the way the lore means it. Twice before. Purged his own progeny. Not lost, not abandoned to attrition at the Rangdan front. Purged, a deliberate act by the Emperor's own hand against his own sons and every Astartes who served beneath them. The Imperium would like the empty plinths to read as an accident of damaged archives, a tragedy of the fog of the Great Crusade. But its own ancient machines remember it as policy. Somebody decided. Somebody who outranked 2 Primarchs decided that 2 Primarchs and their entire bloodlines should cease to have existed. The asymmetry is not the Imperium failing to keep a record. It is the Imperium succeeding, completely, at destroying one. But before we get to why, you need to understand how, because the how tells you this was a decision and not an accident. An edict of obliteration is not death. The Imperium is perfectly comfortable with death. It dispenses it the way other institutions dispense memos. Obliteration is something colder. It is unpersoning. It is the systematic removal of a man from history, while leaving the rest of history apparently intact. The statue recut so the plinth no longer matches a face. The name struck from the rosters. The brothers who knew him forbidden, by policy, and by something deeper than policy, from speaking of him. The Imperium did not simply stop talking about the 2nd and the 11th. It manufactured their absence, deliberately, at the level of state archive.
And here is the thing about a manufactured absence. It requires a decision. Someone with the authority to delete 2 Primarchs sat down and decided that deletion was the correct course, which means there was a reason. The whole of this argument lives in that single fact. Erasure on this scale is not a thing that happens to you. It is a thing that is done to you by someone for a purpose. There is one more detail about the mechanism that I think gives the whole thing away, and it is small enough to miss. The erasure was thorough on paper. Names struck, rosters scrubbed, the official archive made smooth and continuous as if there had only ever been 18. But it was not thorough in private. On the throne of Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's own regent, the most trusted being in the Imperium after the Emperor himself, there sit 2 skulls, and they are marked. One bears the numeral of the 2nd, one bears the numeral of the 11th. Stop and think about what that means. The man who oversaw the deletion of these 2 sons from the memory of the species kept a private memorial to them on the seat of his own power. You do not do that for a thing you despise. You do not enshrine the monster on your throne. You keep a marker like that for something you are grieving, or something you are guarding, or something you have sworn to remember precisely because everyone else has been ordered to forget. The public record says these 2 never existed. The private architecture of the Imperium's most powerful office says, "We know exactly who they were, and we will not let ourselves forget, even as we make certain you do." That contradiction, total erasure outside, deliberate remembrance inside, is not the signature of shame. It is the signature of a secret being kept on purpose. And then the records go quiet. They go quiet in a very specific way, and the silence has a texture worth describing. In Graham McNeil's The Outcast Dead, the first Horus heresy novel set entirely on Terra, there is a moment in the Great Hall where the Primarchs are memorialized, and McNeil writes that the 2nd and 11th plinths had stood vacant for a very long time, and that no one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers. But the detail that should stop you cold is the one about Rogel Dorn. Dorn, the text tells us, had known them, not known of them, known them, if only briefly. So this is not a case of 2 legions that died in obscurity before their brothers arrived. The Primarchs of the 2nd and the 11th were real enough, present enough, that the most rigid and honest of all the loyal Primarchs had stood in a room with them, and by the time of the heresy, that same Primarch will not name them, and the plinths where they should stand are simply empty, and the silence around the absence is so total that it has become a kind of architecture. The Imperium did not just remove the men. It built the hole, and then taught everyone not to look into it. Here is where the dominant story starts to fall apart, because the Imperium would like you to believe that erasure equals embarrassment, that the 2nd and the 11th were deleted because they were shameful, that they failed or fell, or did something the Imperium could not bear to admit it had produced. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable, until you remember the other 9. Look at what the Imperium is willing to keep on the record. It keeps the son who slew his own brothers in the dark. It keeps the one who became a creature of the warp and led a legion of sorcerers against the throne. It keeps the gladiator whose mind was a wound and whose legion was a contagion. It keeps the schemer, the zealot, the bitter engineer, the pale stalker of the night. It keeps, above all, Horus, the favored son who turned his fleet on Terra and put a blade into his father. If the Imperium erased Primarchs out of shame, those 9 would be the first names struck. They are the most shameful thing the Emperor ever produced, and every one of them is still in the books. So, embarrassment is not the variable. Pain is not the variable either. There is no pain the Imperium is unwilling to memorialize, no humiliation it will not carve into stone if carving it serves a purpose. The traitors are kept precisely because keeping them is useful. A traitor on the record is a warning. The Imperium puts Horus in the textbook, so the next 10,000 years of soldiers know what betrayal looks like, what it costs, how it ends. The 9 traitors are a control group, and the experiment they let us run is simple. They prove that the Imperium does not erase its Primarchs for shame, for pain, for failure, or for treachery, because the most shameful, painful, failed, treacherous sons of all are still right there on the shelf.
Whatever got the 2nd and the 11th erased was a category the 9 traitors did not belong to. It was rarer than treason, and worse, in the Imperium's eyes, than the man who tried to depose God. And I want to push the control group logic one more step, because this is where it stops being a clever observation and becomes something closer to proof. A control group works by holding everything constant except the one variable you are testing. Look at how much these two groups share. Both are Primarchs, the same impossible engineering, the same gene craft, the same place in the Emperor's design. Both led legions of Astartes. Both fought the Great Crusade. The traitors and the lost ones are, biologically and institutionally, the same kind of being. The only thing that differs between the group that was kept and the group that was struck is the one thing we are trying to explain. And the surviving evidence says that one thing is loyalty. The kept group betrayed the Emperor and stayed in the books. The struck group, by every record that survives, did not betray him and was deleted. If you ran that experiment in a laboratory and got that result, you would not conclude that erasure correlates with wrongdoing. You would conclude that erasure correlates, somehow, with faithful service. And then you would spend the rest of your career trying to understand the mechanism that turns loyalty into a thing that has to be hidden. That is precisely the question the Imperium has spent 10,000 years making sure no one finishes asking. Worse than treason. Hold on to that phrase because the canon actually says it, and it is the hinge of everything. The lore is explicit that the offense of the 2nd and the 11th was treated as worse than that of the openly traitorous legions.
And I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing that separates this from the conspiracy slop. That phrase, worse than treason, cuts two ways. It could mean they did something monstrous. I am not going to pretend the asymmetry only points toward heroism. A careful reading has to admit that worse than treason could describe a horror as easily as it describes a triumph. But here is why I do not think it points toward a simple atrocity. If the 2nd and the 11th had been monsters, if they had done something the Imperium found revolting, the Imperium had a template for that, and it is the template it used on the traitors. You keep the monster on the record as a warning. You do not erase a cautionary tale. The whole value of a cautionary tale is that people remember it. The only things you erase are the things you cannot afford to have remembered even as a warning. And that is a very short list. It is not made of villains. It is made of secrets.
This is the point where the audience that lives in this lore has been ahead of the writers for years. One viewer put it in a single line that has more analytical weight than most of the essays written on the subject. That the two lost ones were still more loyal than the traitor legions ever were. That is the asymmetry stated as a moral fact, and it lands because it is almost certainly true on the available evidence. The last we see of them, they are bleeding at the Rangdan front. We have no record of them turning. Another viewer sharpened it further, and this is the version I find hardest to argue with. That the two lost Primarchs were proven the most loyal, and their records were expunged not to punish them, but to protect them. Read that again, because it inverts the entire frame. Expunged to protect. Not deletion as a sentence, deletion as a shield. You do not unperson a man you despise. You parade him. You unperson a man you need to keep safe, or a man whose existence, if known, would put something else at terrible risk. And that splits the possibility space into two clean halves, both of which fit every fact we have. The first half. They were erased to protect a still-living asset. That something, a Primarch, a capability, a tool, is too valuable to lose and too dangerous to advertise. So the Imperium did the only thing that keeps a thing both alive and secret. It deleted the paperwork around it, removed the name, sealed the file, and let the galaxy assume the absence meant death. The second half. They were erased to bury a capability. That one or both of these sons could do something, be something, that the Imperium dared not let its enemies, or even its own citizens, know was possible. A weapon that worked too well. An answer to a problem the Emperor had not yet announced he was afraid of. Notice that both halves share a single structure.
In both, the erasure is not a punishment for what the Second and the 11th did wrong. It is a containment of what they did right. The utility was the threat. If you want the historical precedent, the Imperium has done exactly this before, and it did it in writing. Read Chris Wright's Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, set at the end of the Unification Wars, and watch what becomes of the Thunder Warriors. These were the Emperor's first super soldiers, the genetically engineered army that conquered Terra and handed him a planet. They won the war. And the moment the war was won, the moment they had served their purpose and become a liability that knew too much, the Imperium disbanded them, retired them, and let them vanish from the official story of how the Imperium was born. The men who won the Emperor his throne were quietly written out of the history of the throne they won. That is not speculation. That is the documented founding behavior of the institution we are talking about.
The Imperium has a habit, baked in from the first day, of erasing the instruments of its own success the instant those instruments become inconvenient. The Thunder Warriors are the proof of concept. The Second and the 11th would simply be the same logic, applied to two Primarchs instead of an army. So if the Imperium will bury the soldiers who won at Terra, what would it do with two sons who succeeded too well at something it could not name? And to answer that, I want to bring in the one Primarch who, more than any other, tells us what the truth must have felt like. There is a thread in the canon about Rogal Dorn that I think is the emotional center of this entire mystery, and a section of the audience has been pointing at it for a long time, that Malcador showed Dorn what had happened to the lost, and that Dorn, having seen it, chose to forget. And here is what makes that more than a fan reading. The canon backs it.
In the lead-up to the siege of Terra, the sealed chamber of the 11th is uncovered inside the Imperial Palace. Dorn finds it. There is a heated exchange with Malcador the Sigillite, and a sudden, involuntary recollection of the lost Primarch's misfortune washes over Dorn, and his response, the response of the single most unbreakably loyal and unbending Primarch the Emperor ever made, is to order the chamber sealed and buried. He calls it a tomb that should be forgotten. He has it covered over, on the eve of the worst battle in human history, rather than leave it open. Think carefully about what that reaction tells you, because Dorn is the perfect instrument for this measurement. Dorn does not flinch from horror. This is the Primarch who would, weeks later, walk through the wreckage of the siege and catalog the dead without breaking. He is the one who feels duty the way other men feel gravity. If the secret of the 11th had been shameful, Dorn would have endured it, the way he endured everything, jaw set, eyes forward, shame he could carry, failure he could carry, atrocity even. Dorn lived in a galaxy made of atrocity, but this he chose to bury. He looked at whatever Malcador showed him and decided, deliberately, that the right thing to do with the memory was to wall it up and never visit it again. That is not the behavior of a man confronting something disgraceful. That is the behavior of a man confronting something unbearable, and the difference matters enormously, because it tells you the truth of the second and the 11th was not a stain you live with. This was a weight, and the most loyal son the Emperor ever built decided the galaxy was better off if the weight stayed buried with him. Now what could be so unbearable to a being like Dorn? Not shameful, not embarrassing, but unbearable, and at the same time so useful that the Imperium needed it to exist while needing the galaxy not to know it existed. I am going to walk the threads the lore actually supports, and I am going to refuse to overclaim on any of them. One thread, a counterweapon. The Imperium built 20 suns, and somewhere in that design there may have been an answer to a problem the Emperor saw coming. A Primarch engineered to stand against the kind of power the Council of Nicaea would later try to legislate out of the legions. Remember Nicaea, called by the Emperor in the first year of M31, where he forbade his legions the use of sorcery and ordered the librarius departments closed.
The Imperium has a documented, dated history of deciding that certain capabilities are too dangerous to keep in the open, even when they are loyal capabilities. Nicaea is the Emperor doing exactly that to powers wielded by his own sons. It is not a long step from forbidding a power to erasing the son who embodied it. The lore lets you stand at that edge. It does not let you jump. A second thread, and I will be equally disciplined here, a vault. In Aaron Dembski Bowden's The First Heretic, a daemon walks a handful of word-bearers through a vision of the Emperor's hidden gene laboratory beneath Terra, where the Primarch project was grown, and the fate of the lost sons brushes against that scene like a held breath.
The idea the cohort keeps returning to is that one of the erased Primarchs is less a person than a repository. That the gene line was too precious to lose and too dangerous to keep on any roster. So it was hidden inside the architecture of the Imperium itself, its name deleted to keep the vault from being found. I want to be scrupulously clear. The canon does not confirm a surviving gene line, and in fact, the official record states no gene seed of the 2nd and the 11th survived into the modern factions. So the gene vault reading runs against a stated line, and I am flagging that honestly. It is a possibility the structure permits, not a fact the canon delivers. And there is a fourth thread, the quietest one, and it is about how far this Imperium will go to keep a strategic secret intact. Read Dan Abnett's Legion.
On the surface, it is a story about the most secretive of all the legions. A brotherhood that fights as spies rather than soldiers, that lies as a matter of doctrine, that will let the galaxy believe almost anything if the deception serves a larger design. But the deeper lesson of that book is institutional. It shows you an Imperium in which the right secret, held by the right hands, is considered worth more than the truth, worth more than reputation, worth more, sometimes, than the lives it costs to keep it. Once you have read it, the erasure of 2 Primarchs stops looking extreme and starts looking like procedure. If the Imperium will let an entire legion build its identity around a lie because the lie protects something vital, then deleting 2 sons to protect something vital is not a horror story. It is the same logic at a larger scale. The 2nd and the 11th would simply be the most expensive secret the Imperium ever decided to keep. Paid for, not in deception, but in deletion.
2 whole bloodlines spent to keep one thing off the record. What unites every honest version of this? The counterweapon, the vault, the hidden asset, the loyal blade sent to do the deed no named son could be allowed to be photographed doing. The secret too valuable to survive being known is one shape, and only one. It is utility too dangerous to memorialize. In every version, the 2nd and the 11th were not erased for what they failed to do or for what they betrayed. They were erased for what they accomplished, for being so good at serving the Emperor that their service became a liability the Imperium could not afford to have written down. That is the common factor the cohort has been circling for years. Not their crime, their competence. And it is the only reading that resolves the asymmetry without contradiction.
The traitors are kept because a traitor remembered is a tool. The loyalists are erased because a loyalist remembered is a leak. So I owe you the honest accounting, and I am going to give it before I close because the difference between this and the slop is whether I tell you the load-bearing truth even when it weakens the drama. Games Workshop has never stated anywhere in any text why the 2nd and the 11th were erased. The motive I have spent this whole argument building is an in-universe reading of a deliberately empty space, and the leading out-of-universe explanation is much simpler and much less dramatic than anything I have said. The blank was left on purpose. Rick Priestley, who built the foundations of this setting, intended the Horus heresy to be a semi-mythological distant past, a thing we were never meant to fully know.
And Aaron Dembski-Bowden, who has written more of the lost Primarch shadow than almost anyone, has said it about as plainly as it can be said. There is not allowed to be an answer. Because the moment there is an answer, the mystery is dead. And the empty slots, left blank originally so that fans and future writers could pour their own stories into them, would close forever. So understand exactly what I am offering you, not proof. The asymmetry is not a smoking gun. It is the strongest piece of evidence in a case the authors built to never be closed. I think it is a very good piece of evidence. I do not think it is a verdict. And anyone who tells you the verdict is in is telling you a story the people who own the universe have promised never to confirm. But the asymmetry remains, and it is the one thing they cannot retract, because it is built into the structure of the canon itself. 18 names kept, 2 struck. And the 2 struck are the 2 with no record of betrayal, last seen bleeding at the worst front of the worst war the Imperium had yet survived. The most successful act of erasure in the history of mankind was performed not on a monster, but, as far as the surviving evidence allows us to see, on the faithful. That is the fact. The reading is mine and the cohort's and yours to weigh, but the fact stands on its own, and it asks a question the Imperium has spent 10,000 years making sure you would never quite get around to asking out loud. 9 of the Emperor's sons turned on him, burned his worlds, killed his children, tried to murder him on his own throne, and the Imperium kept every one of their names, because a traitor remembered is a traitor you can warn the next generation about. But 2 of his sons stayed loyal, and those 2, the Imperium erased so thoroughly that their brothers flinch from the memory. Ask yourself what a man hides more carefully: the enemy who tried to destroy him, or the weapon he used to survive. The traitors are written down so you'll fear them. The loyal sons were cut out so you'll never know what they were for. The Imperium didn't erase its failures. It erased its successes. And it has spent 10,000 years making sure you never ask why.